Magnus Carlsen is renowned for taking on a diverse range of opponents, conquering grandmasters like Hikaru Nakamura and even going up against non-professional players like Bill Gates. From mastering the intricacies of blindfold chess to an astounding 125-game win streak, Magnus Carlsen unquestionably stands as the greatest of all time in the world of chess. But what happened when Magnus Carlsen faced off against Grandmaster David Howell? There was a peculiar catch. The chess pieces were all Airthings devices. As they squared off, the room filled with suspense, as chess strategy intertwined with the indoor air quality management. David initiates the game by advancing his pawn to e4, to which Magnus responds by moving his pawn to g6. David follows up with the pawn move to d4 on the queen side, prompting Magnus to reply with his own pawn to d6. David proceeds to develop his knight to c3, and Magnus repositions his bishop to g7. After a series of developing moves, David advances his pawn to a4, and Magnus decides to retaliate with his pawn. David decides to capture the pawn on c5, and Magnus attacks the knight with his pawn. David responds by moving his knight and increasing the CO2 levels, clearly trying to suffocate his opponent's position. Magnus captures on c5 with his knight. David decides to castle, and Magnus develops his knight to f6, which allows David to capture it with his knight. Magnus, with a puzzled expression, scratched his head and said, "Hold on, David, did you just capture my knight? I thought I had an airtight defense." Magnus has an aha moment as he realizes he can capture the knight back with his bishop. Magnus instantly goes for it, and David slides his pawn to attack the bishop. We see a pawn exchange here, and now White's pawn is attacking the bishop, but instead of retreating his bishop, Magnus decides to capture the bishop on d3 with his knight. David instantly captures the bishop with his pawn, gaining the upper hand in the game. Magnus commits yet another significant blunder, attempting to deliver a check with his queen. However, this puts David in a tricky spot, since moving any of his other pieces would result in an invalid move. After a careful evaluation of the board, David comes to the realization that he had previously castled his king, positioning it on the g1 square. With his newfound clarity, David slides his king over to h1. In a surprising turn of events, Magnus makes another mistake by attempting to create a fork with his knight, unaware that David's rook is guarding the crucial f2 square. Magnus's move inadvertently grants him the opportunity to capture the rook with his queen. The best move for David is to capture the pawn on e7 with his pawn, because, after this move, David can prevent black from castling. But instead of that, David slides his bishop to g5. This allows Magnus to castle his king to safety. Now David realizes and captures the pawn with his pawn, simultaneously attacking the black's rook. Magnus slides the rook out of danger, and David slides his bishop to f6, blocking the dark squares. Magnus develops his bishop to b7, attacking the knight and threatening to recapture it. Unaware of these upcoming threats, calculating in this tight situation is quite difficult without knowing the actual chess pieces. David slides his queen to d4, setting up an X-ray with his queen and bishop. Magnus again makes a critical error by capturing the pawn on c2 with his queen. After this move, White can initiate the attack with his bishop and queen, which will lead to a winning position, but David misses the opportunity and slides his rook to f1, giving away the chance. Magnus slides his rook to c8, forming a battery on c-file. After playing a couple of more moves, Magnus decides to trade the rooks. He captures the rook on f2, and David captures back. After that, Magnus again initiates a trade by capturing the knight on f3 with his bishop. David captures back with his pawn. Magnus starts maneuvering his king intensely because both of them have few seconds on their clock. Playing such a defensive move will save time for Magnus. David skillfully advances his bishop to c3, unveiling a discovered check on Magnus's king. In a swift response, Magnus interposes his pawn to block the check. Seizing the moment, David capitalizes by capturing the pawn on b4 with his bishop. Both players commence maneuvering their pieces strategically. David takes the initiative by initiating a pawn exchange on g4 and subsequently relocates his queen to g3. Magnus, ever vigilant, seizes the opportunity by advancing his rook to g8. His clever strategy involves capturing the pawn on f3 with his pawn, creating a pin that puts David's queen in jeopardy, potentially leading to the loss of David's queen. Knowing all of these tactics, David slides his king to h2. This move allows Magnus to check the king with his queen. Now David has to slide his king to g1. Magnus immediately captures the pawn, throwing a surprise attack on the queen and pinning it to the king. But David has different plans. He slides his pawn to e8, promoting his pawn to a queen, and simultaneously giving a check to Magnus's king. Magnus scratches his head in confusion. He himself admits that he was completely unaware of that pawn. Magnus captures the queen with his rook. David instantly slides his queen to c7, giving a check to Magnus. But as he's going to tap the clock, he realizes he lost time, leaving David in checkmate by the forces of time management. Magnus must have secretly programmed that clock to be his personal chess ally.